And I think today's topic is a particularly interesting topic that I think is at the core of what's happening in the Middle East, about the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. So anyway, with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn to Ishaq to start. I'm going to finish with a couple of questions on my side, and then I'll open it to the floor.
So tonight, I want to speak about this one topic that fascinates me. Basically, to complete your biography, I left the World Bank at around the events of Tahrir, because I thought it's a good time to not be in an organization where you have to clear anything you write, and that it's a time you need a little bit more freedom to think. And one of the topics that interested me a lot is that of the kind of capitalism that we had in the Middle East. And partly it's because of the stories you heard in Egypt and in Tunisia about the billions of dollars stolen, and partly it's because we've been thinking for a long time about how come with all the reforms we don't get the supply response in the Middle East, and why is it that there is unemployment, and so not enough jobs. And the bigger question was, what kind of capitalism do we have? And I hope the discussion tonight could be about what kind of capitalism can we have in the future. Could we move to a more socially acceptable moral capitalism? So the concern about chronism was really a concern about the extent, if you like, of chronism. I was really interested in measuring how distortionary was the way in which capitalism was practiced in Egypt and in other countries of the region. Because after all, connections between business people and politicians, this exists everywhere. It's not specific to the region. So really it's a matter of degrees and forms and impact. And the big question is, the two questions I want to address, or the three, are, can we describe this chronism more, and can we actually evaluate to what extent it affected the economy? That's question number one. Question number two is, what is special about Egypt and the MENA region more generally? And question number three, perhaps it'll be a little bit the center of our discussion, is how can we move forward given that inheritance? I'll show you pictures. I'll go fast over some pictures. I want to try to speak for about half an hour, a bit more, so we have time for a discussion. If you want me to stop, I'll zoom through many of the pictures, but if you want me to stop, you tell me. This picture is simply to kind of set the stage. This looks like a mountain. It's government expenditure in Egypt and Jordan, two countries I picked, over the past 50 years. And it's to show you the amazing ride, actually, the amazing transformation in terms of society and the economy over these 50 years. In Egypt, government expenditure goes as high as 65% of GDP in the mid-70s and 80s. And when Mubarak takes over sometime in the early 80s, he has to bring down government spending from those heights of 60% where you control everything. Everybody works for the state. All the public enterprises are political tools to stay on top. He has to bring that down all the way to something like 25% of GDP. So it's a huge transformation, politically, socially. State that was socialist changes, and basically through that structural adjustment period of the 90s, you have a complete reorganization of power with basically the ruling party becoming much more associated with capitalists that were old money, state bourgeoisie, various people that become really the leading actors in the economy. And so that transformation is politically very important. Now, as the red line, public investment, falls over that period, the state is not the leading engine of the economy anymore. The hope is that the green line, private investment, will go up. But as you can see, it doesn't really, it goes up a little bit, but not higher than at an earlier period where it complemented very high state investments. And so, I mean, this is really the challenge of the Mubarak regime. You know, they can't get the private sector to become the engine of the economy, even though the state pulls out. And the big question is why? Other elements of this, the red, this is 100% of the labor force. Where is the labor force in various countries of the region? The red is the formal private sector. So look how small it is. This is in 2010, after 30 years of reform. Jordan is more successful. In Egypt, 15% of the labor force in 2010 worked for the formal private sector, that sector to which all the energies, all the reforms were devoted. So not a very successful experience, both in terms of size of private investment and actually the size of the labor force working there. Let me not go over this, but basically what you have is, you know, the old large public enterprises are privatized, cut in pieces, and you don't have really the emergence of many large private firms. What you have instead is the growth of the informal economy, by and large, and a few large companies that, as I'll show you, are very close to the regime. All right. Now, one problem, you know, we ask firms, there are various surveys that ask the private sector, what is it that is the main constraint to growth? And one constraint that keeps coming up is that basically the state policy is not credible. They don't believe that the state is really developing the private sector. They don't believe that the regulations are implemented in a fair and predictable way. These are various countries. See, well, we don't even have Egypt here. And so the technocratic response to that is, you know, improve state capacity, fight corruption, make sure that regulators know what they're doing and do it in a fair manner. And lots of the reforms were really driven by this technocratic idea that it can just work if regulators behave better, if corruption is uprooted. But the big question really that I think, or the big issue that has been missed, is that, you know, the private sector activity takes place in a broader political environment, which we have to understand. And that really this kind of crony relationship has emerged as a way for the rulers to consolidate power. That is, they don't trust a private sector that's not closely connected to them. There are red lines. They're afraid that the private sector will finance the opposition. The security forces play a very important role, the mukhabarat, and they play an important role in the private sector as well, in allowing some to rise and others not to rise. And so that gave rise to a system of privileges for the few, for the trusted political allies, and restrictions on other parts of the private sector that was not trusted. And my point, or my search, is to ask, does this explain, actually, does this kind of political regime explain what we see in the private sector, what we see in terms of low growth, a lot of informality, not many big firms, besides those that are connected. So really what I'm trying to do in the next 10 minutes, what I want to show you are results from quantitative research, really, that tries to evaluate several hypotheses. And here are the hypotheses. And I mean, what I want to keep in mind is that in spite of the headlines in the Egyptian newspapers, you know, Mubarak has not stolen $70 billion, there are a lot of exaggeration, and, you know, cronyism can be good. It could be good. In countries like Korea, being close to the general, you know, allowed big business people to borrow a lot of money, but at the same time, their performance was very good. You know, they were managed. Client-patron relationships can actually deliver performance if the patron is leading the charge and disciplining the clients. But it can also be a terrible system if the clients are not disciplined and they steal money and diversify abroad and don't invest in the economy. If they're not managed properly, they can also distort politics, financing the ruling regime and the like. And so how can we tell what exactly is going on? The three hypotheses that I want to test are, number one, the PC politically connected firms capture labor and capital factors of production, but they are run inefficiently. They are not managed efficiently. They actually destroy some of the capital that they borrow. They're not as efficient as the rest of the private sector. I want to test whether this is true.
You want to know what PC means? Politically connected.
Politically connected, the cronies. Politically connected firms. Number two, how about the non-politically connected firms, the others? Are they hurt by the existence of connected firms in the sectors in which they work? Can I observe that sectors that are dominated by politically connected firms are less dynamic than other sectors? Can I empirically test that? And finally, or rather number two, where do these connected firms operate? After all, if they operate in what we call the tradable sectors where we have foreign competition, they should be able to survive because foreign competition will wipe them out. So are they protected by tariff barriers? Do they go into the non-tradable sectors in distribution and tourism sectors that are left for them to make, basically? Can I observe that? These are the three questions that I want to look at, and it's work that I've done with various co-authors listed here. So first we need to identify the connected firms, and we've done that by basically looking at 4 think tanks, institutions that Gamal Mubarak has organized around himself. We're really focusing on the 2000s. It's a special period in Egypt. It's the end of a regime, basically. Gamal Mubarak is rising. In 2003, we get a cabinet made out of business people. The prime minister, many of the ministers are actually big private entrepreneurs, and so they're all around Gamal Mubarak. He has 4 think tanks, the Policy Committee, the American Egyptian Business Association, and 2 others, a foundation that his mother Suzanne runs, and the Policy Research Center where many of our friends worked. And so I just take the 32 members of the boards of these 4 groups, and I trace what they either own or companies that they manage, and so we get 104 companies, and then we look at companies owned by these companies, and we end up with 469 firms, which are pretty much controlled by these 32 people. And so we're going to ask ourselves, these firms are in half the sectors and in half of the industry. So we're actually going to be able to compare these firms with the other large Egyptian firms, altogether about 5,000 firms we have information on. And they're in half the sectors, so we're going to also be able to compare sectors with political connections with other sectors. We can even tell how many firms are in the connected sector, so we have, if you like, a chronism intensity. And so this gives rise to, beautiful empirical regressions, which I will not show you. There is very high concentration of firms in some sectors. Typically, these are the new sectors that have opened up in the 2000s. Tourism, Egypt changed enormously in the 2000s. Tourism was open, the energy sector went up, the whole distribution system changed, and they very much, the construction business increased a whole lot, and they moved into these new sectors, basically. They were very much vertically integrated. This is one example. They tend to form pyramids. Each one of these families owned lots of businesses, and they got organized basically around pyramids. This is a way to maximize the influence of your equity, if you like. You control the second tier with 50% only, and the third tier with 25% only, it's a well-known way for family businesses to function in ways that maximize the power of equity. Okay, first question, do they make more profits than other firms? This is the extra profit that they make compared to the other firms over time. And you see they do make more profits, 2-3% a year, until 2011, where the profitability drops. So this gives you a feel that, you know, maybe without their contacts, they're not as profitable. But we want to ask ourselves, where does this profitability come from? Is it because they're more efficient? Or is it because they are in sectors where they can make more profits? And how are they able to get other firms not to be in those sectors? How do they exclude them? That's a nice experiment. See these two lines? These are the stock market index of the connected firms and the non-connected firms. The connected in blue, the non-connected in red. This is the global crisis of 2008. The whole stock market collapses, most types of firms. And this is the events of 2011. You see the whole market drops, but the blue line drops much more. So the market is saying, these people are all, Mubarak and his friends are all in jail, many of the ministers are in jail, they've lost their connections. So these firms now are without connections. And so the market is valuing them less, right? And so through this event study, we can actually measure the value that the market attributes to those connections. And it's about 25% of the value of the firms. It gives you already a feel for how the market values those connections that just disappeared suddenly on, what was it now? June? No, December 2010. January. Yeah. The market closes on, I think, January 15 and reopen in March. So the market has 2-3 months to think about what are the proper values. Okay, now we look at the behavior of these firms since 2004, the Nasif cabinet. Basically, in 2004, these firms were about the same size as the other large firms, the other 100 large firms. But between 2004 and 2010, they grow on average 7 times when the rest of the big corporations stay at the same size. So they grow immensely. They become dominant in the sectors where they are, and we can calculate that they make monopoly profit in the sense that the larger their market share, the more their profits. They're able to squeeze the market. They borrow much more. And actually, it's ridiculous, but basically, these 32 individuals with their 469 companies managed in 2010 to have 92% of the credit going to the 1,500 largest firms in the economy. They literally become the private sector. Everybody else is not growing, not innovating, living on their old assets, and these firms are growing like hell and absorbing. I mean, I had a hard time believing these figures as we were finding them. And the big question is, how do they do it? Because after all, the banking sector was liberalized in Egypt. Maybe Amir will help us, he's a banker. And so, you know, Mubarak cannot pick the phone and tell the bank, lend them money. So they must have privileges in other ways that make them more profitable, so that actually, when I visited banks, private banks in Egypt only wanted to lend to these firms. These were the profitable, the interesting firms, and actually banking concentration in the age of banking liberalization. The banking sector was recapitalized and liberalized around 2003. Became much more concentrated than it was before it was liberalized. So how did it happen? They must have gotten privileges, and so the question was for us, can we actually find some of these mechanisms that give them these advantages? So we, you know, there are various stories about land or privatization and the like, but we found data on really 3 areas, which I'll look at here quickly. One is non-tariff barriers. Are they in areas that are more protected from international competition? The second is energy subsidies. There are very large energy subsidies in Egypt. Maybe 40% of the budget in recent years goes into subsidizing energy. So do they manage to grab a big chunk of that? And thirdly, as you know, tax inspectors and the like could be really bothersome in a country like Egypt. There's a lot of predation by the bureaucracy. Is there more or less predation to them relative to other firms? Can we tell? And there are various databases that we access to try to answer those questions. So this is the first one. Trade was liberalized in Egypt, so the blue line is the average tariff. Customs went down. But what went up at the same time are what's called non-tariff barriers. These are various rules to exclude unfair competition normally. So things like sanitary provisions or FDI restrictions and the like. And it's very much rules that are implemented by bureaucrats. You get an inspector to go and visit if the meat is not of good enough quality, the factory is closed. And so various sectors are subjected to more or less rules of this type. And we have actually a database that measures that. And basically what you see is, over time these non-tariff barriers goes up as protection comes down. This happens in many countries. Basically, as there is more foreign competition, firms are uneasy and they lobby for various ways to keep that competition out. And that happens in Egypt. But what's interesting is that when I compare the presence of politically connected firms and other firms across industries by counting how many types of restrictions there are for industries, you find that there are industries with one protection, there are industries with two protections. When you get down to industries that are very protected, 3 types of protection, you have 71% of the connected firms are in such industries, where only 4% of the market is in those industries. And you can go down, there are of course less and less industries with a lot of protection, but this number is striking. This suggests that politically connected firms specialize in being in protected industries. It suggests that they have a comparative advantage at calling the regulator and telling him, send inspectors to this firm because this firm is bothering us. They're amazingly concentrated in sectors here with many protections. So that's one piece of evidence that gives you a feel for how they work. They work based on connections. And it's not just connections with the president, but it's all the way down to the administration, and they have an influence on regulators and inspectors. And they can really bother firms that compete with them. You don't want to compete with them because you're going to get the inspectors that will come and find something problematic in your factory. This is the second experiment we do, which is we asked whether there are disproportionately in industries that take advantage of energy subsidies, and the answer is yes. If you look at high energy intensive industries, 36% of them are in those industries compared to only 8% of the non-connected firms. Actually, the way this works is that if you are in a high, in what they call energy intensive industry, you get your petrol or your mazout very cheap, like a third of the world price. And these industries are well known, things like cement or production of electricity or steel, things like that. But you have to get your license every year that you are in a high energy intensive industry. And you may be in that industry, but you don't get the license if you're not connected. So this is how this particular scheme works. And here's a third much more prevalent exercise, which is we look here at the World Bank conducts these enterprise surveys every year where they ask, or every couple of years, where they ask firms about doing business. right? And these are some of the questions of doing business. You know, how many inspections do you get every year? Tax inspections, custom inspections, labor inspection, do you bribe, and the like. And basically, what you notice, if now we're comparing sectors, is that the sectors here with a lot of politically connected firms, as opposed to sectors without politically connected firms, those sectors simply get inspected much more often. That's all we observe, but my guess is it's the non-connected people that really bear the brunt.
I was going to say, this is counterintuitive, no?
Yeah, but are they real inspections? That's the question.
Sorry?
Are they real inspections? Is it just kind of like FaceTime visits?
I mean, in this particular survey, we don't know who's connected and who's not. So I'm just comparing industries here. And what we observe is that the industries that are connected have a lot more inspections of all sorts. So my guess is it's the non-connected people in those sectors that get inspected very often, which is why they don't want to stay in those sectors, right? Got it?
If you're unlucky enough to
Yeah.
be in that industry,
Exactly.
they're going to be sending a lot of,
Exactly.
if you're not one of us, we're going to send love inspectors to you.
Exactly.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
Good. So, profitability, they're more profitable. Why are they more profitable? We can actually try to, I mean, we do regressions and see whether that profitability depends on their productivity or on the sectors in which they are. And we find that the profitability is entirely explained by the sectors in which they are. They are in the energy-intensive sectors, they are in the sectors protected by non-tariff barriers, and that explains entirely their profits and even more. So that once you control for the sectors in which they are, you find that they're actually less productive. They use capital less productively than the non-protected firms. The differential that we measure is somewhere between 2 and 3 percentage points on capital, less productive than others. And you can ask yourself, why is it that they are less productive? Because that's going to be an important question. I think part of the answer is they're much more loyal than efficient. You know, they were picked for other qualities than being a good manager. But they're also very much taxed. I mean, they're asked constantly to finance NGOs, to hire people in important constituencies. They're constantly taxed by their friends. They have to return the favor, basically, from the company's books. And that taxes them and makes them actually less productive. We can also, I mean, there's some evidence, especially in other work that has been done in Tunisia, that the fact that they are in the very protected sector is not simply that because they migrate to the more protected sector, but it's because they lobby for protection in the sector in which they are. So really they distort very much industrial policy. Instead of industrial policy being a tool for development, it becomes actually a tool for rent seeking. So that's a big cost to society. All right, last kind of questions that we ask is, fine, they're not very efficient, but you know, how much of a weight this is for the economy? It's just 400 firms. And so really one could argue that the reason Egypt didn't grow a whole lot, grew at 4 or 5% instead of the 10% that we would have wanted to see given the reforms on paper. To answer that, we have to see what happens to the non-connected firms. Can we say that the non-connected firms are not very dynamic, they want to hide below the radar screen in order not to be taxed? Are they afraid of this unfair competition? Can I characterize their behavior? Because this is the whole economy. If they are affected negatively, then we can really have macro impacts out of this chronism. And this is a picture to illustrate the idea. If you look at, these are amazing pictures, by the way. Here we have 2.5 million firms represented in this graph from the industrial census of Egypt. And this is the industrial census of Turkey that has like 6 million firms. There's a lot of information in these graphs. And these are firms organized by their size and by their age. Okay?
Now what's on
The number of the distribution of these firms. Yeah. So what you see in Turkey is that as they age, firms also grow. You know, they move here. There are firms here. In Egypt, they age, but they do not grow. So what I have here is a missing middle. We don't have firms of middle size. They tend to just age. They don't really grow. And then we have these firms here, which are pretty much the CRONY firms. They tower over everything. And so the contention is that these guys is what explains the middle, right? The metaphor, if you like, is by opening huge supermarkets, you know, one by big neighborhood, what survives are the little shops at the corner, but not the middle supermarkets in every street, because they just can't compete against these guys, and these guys just manage through the connection to get the land, the best land in every part of town, to just dominate the market. So that's the contention, and the question is whether we can actually observe that. And I would spare you the regressions, but basically the results are yes, big time. You know, we can explain the lack of dynamism, the lack of entry, the lack of growth, the lack of creative destructions also. I mean, inefficient firms remain. Small firms don't grow. By the phenomena of chronism. When I compare sectors, the more crony a sector is, the less dynamic competition is in this sector. And that pretty much goes a long way to explain, I think, this missing middle. So, how are we doing on time?
Good.
Good? All right. So, I mean, these are basically the results. So we're going to think a little bit now about what this means. So let me take a few steps along the thinking, and then we'll continue with the discussion. These are results in Tunisia are kind of similar. And this is the summing up. All right. So now we need to ask ourselves, what is special about the Middle East? Why is it that we end up with kind of crony capitalists everywhere? You think of Syria, of Libya, of other countries one doesn't necessarily want to name. You know, everywhere the big businessmen are very connected. Basically, they're cousins, they're from the same tribe. If Egypt results generalize, it looks like it's a type of capitalism that's quite different from say, cronism in Korea. That, you know, where you know, you got your credit if you exported. And the government was extremely disciplined in making this relationship work. Now, it seems to me that the main difference, and not just with Korea, with other countries, is that this was a region that liberalized economically in the mid-80s, but did not liberalize politically. Unlike Latin America, for example, when they hit the crisis in the mid-80s, and the reforms, they also had to open up the polity. In the Middle East, they didn't. And so what we ended up with is a regime which is very closed politically, but supposedly open economically. And as I said earlier, this cannot really function, because an open economy can finance the Muslim Brotherhood, can finance your opposition, and this could not be allowed. There were red lines, if you like, and only some business people were allowed to be in the heights of the economy. And when new sectors open up, they had to go and kind of occupy those sectors so that the opposition didn't go there. And I think that is, and of course other things supported this kind of regime. Repression was very important in terms of keeping the poorer parts of the population quiet, and cooptation was very important, especially the system of subsidies to keep the middle class and the richer people in this new coalition. And the support from the West was also very important in keeping the system going. And that was also a characteristic of this region compared to other regions. not go over this detail. And so really, we ended up with a variety of capitalism, as I described it. In a way, it's not too different from what we see in China and Russia. I mean, it has our regional characteristics. But the question is two questions. How do we place it in terms of the global picture, in terms of degree of corruption and growth, and where do we go from there? This is a picture taken in 2004, where we look at growth, per capita growth, versus corruption, extent of corruption, and the MENA region is somewhere there. And so you see it grows more than Latin America, even though it has about the same level of corruption, but it grows much less than the Asian countries. And since 2004, it has very much moved in this direction. It has increased, corruption has increased without growth increasing. And so I want to try to understand how to think about that. And this is one framework that you may find useful in the discussion from political scientists Rock and Bonnet. They offer this typology of regimes. They say, chronism could be good or bad. How can we differentiate? It's going to depend a lot on this patron-client relation. Is it tight? Who is the leading partner? How is the bargaining situation, position of the clients versus the patron? And they say it depends on basically two things. One is the time horizon of the ruler. To the extent that the ruler is stable and can think long term, they would be able to manage their clients. On the other hand, if they're very short-termist, then they won't. So that's one dimension. And the other dimension, the vertical dimension, is how coordinated is the ruler. Do we have President Mubarak, or do we have various factions of the regime? The Mubarak, the army, different parts of the regime making different deals. And that actually gives us, this 2x2 matrix, a very interesting typology. You have here the rulers that are kind of tight, well organized, unified, that can think long term. And these are the Koreas, if you like, of the 80s. Here the general can actually discipline their capitalists. And actually, there's a positive relation between corruption and growth in such an environment. Corruption oils the wheels of the economy. The system is predatory, and so you pay a little bit, and you actually get the wheel turning. It's what economists call stationary bandits. They can think long term. On the other hand, if you have a unified regime, but with a very short horizon, these are like Argentinian presidents. They know they're there only for 4 years. And so they don't have a lot of time. They're not interested in the long-term growth of the economy. They're interested in stealing, in grabbing quickly. And so you get pretty lousy impact of corruption on growth. If, in addition, the system is fragmented, you kind of get an African situation, what I've seen in Ghana, basically. You have a lot of predation, competition, and short-termism at the same time, clientelism. And if you have stationary bandits with weak and fragmented, you get the kind of Philippines under Marcos type of regime. Now the question is, to conclude, I guess, where is Mubarak and Ben Ali in this kind of image? In my mind, I mean, in their early liberalization period, they were pretty much here. They were young and vigorous and were looking at 30 years of power, and they were pretty much disciplining their capitalists. But over time, as we approached the 2000s and they were moving towards the end of the regime, and we're starting to have competition as well within the ruling party. Is it Mubarak? Is it the army? More fragmentation as well. We basically started to move in basically to the left and to the bottom. And I think that's what characterized the late period in the Arab region where basically a lot of regimes were at the end of their trajectory. All right, I am going to stop here, and here are some pictures about basically the very poor perceptions, this is Gallup polls, by people of the private sector. The private sector has a very bad name in the region right now. These are the percentages of people that think that business is corrupt in different countries, and they're very high figures. And people also tend to think that when business is corrupt, government is also corrupt. These are different. In Lebanon, for example, about 90% of the people polled think that the government is corrupt and businesses are corrupt. But what's interesting in this picture is not just that everybody thinks there's a lot of corruption in all these countries, but that relationship, that they see the government and the businesses together in this. And so we have a big problem. How do we go towards a future where the private sector has to lead, given these very bad perception, given the inheritance, really?
Where's Turkey on that chart?
Turkey is not Arab, so I only have Arab countries from Gallup. And so I guess I leave you with these questions. The technocratic approach by itself would not work. We would need a political will to have actually proper competition in the private sector to achieve some of these kind of policy reforms, better competition and the like. But at the same time, right now, the private sector doesn't really strike us as an important political actor. And so that's an issue. And that's part of the inheritance. Only and non-political or friends were allowed to rise that much. We're going to ask Amir about the role of the banking sector in all of this. Is it part of the problem? Is it part of the solution? I mean, 92% of the credit going to just a few individuals when the whole economy is starving for credit. How do you actually democratize credit? And the last question, where are the philosophers of liberalism? I mean, this is one thing that's striking is how little we have in terms of thinking, in terms of political philosophy and what economic liberalism could look like in the future. Okay, I'll stop at that.
So this was actually absolutely brilliant, I thought. I mean, it was extremely interesting, and I kept on thinking that maybe what you need to do is actually go back to the World Bank and talk to the IMF about this. And it just happens that I actually spent a year of my life at the IMF working on the Egyptian program in '95 and '96. And so at the end of the day, there was always that thought in the back of my mind, what are we doing here? And I remember coining, me and somebody who just got fired yesterday, Muhammad Larian, coining the phrase privatizing the private sector. The importance of how do you let the private sector wean them from the largesse of the public sector. So anyway, I'm starting so that people can hear me better. I guess what I'm going to do is sort of, eventually I'm going to address the question of finance and how I see finance playing into this. But beginning, I'm going to ask a more conceptual question to you, which is the relationship between the public sector and the private sector, between the government and the private enterprise is not, as you mentioned, a Middle East phenomenon. It's not an Arab phenomenon. You see it in most countries, right? I mean, whether it's the shareball in Korea, it's in Japan, you see it in the difference, however, is in some places it seems to work, in other places it doesn't seem to work. And I'm wondering whether an explanation along the lines of the omnipotency of the dictator is really the answer, or whether it's the political liberalization, the sequencing of whether it's the answer. I mean, Korea up till 1991 wasn't even a liberal, politically liberal. There's been enormous amounts of political repression in places that have otherwise done extremely well in terms of the relationship between the public sector and the private sector. There seems to be something else. And it's not a coincidence, I think, at least I'm putting it as a thesis out there, that the places where that relationship hasn't worked happen to be in places where commodities, and oil in particular, play a bigger role. You see it in Russia, you see it in Africa, you're seeing in the Middle East. In places where it happens that it seems interesting, the places where there's a much healthier relationship between the public and private sector seems to be in places which are benefit from international trade, from exports, right? From places where the resources of this resources of the society doesn't come from under the ground, but have to be created through higher value added. And the question that and then I ask myself is why is it that what is it about the latter group that seems to provide that value added that allows that oil of also that, no pun intended, of corruption to work and produce high growth, while it doesn't in the Middle East and the Arab world? And there it seems to be about the notion of competitiveness. The Arab world, just like Africa, just like Russia today, is simply not a competitive place. And sort of think about it. Competitiveness, profitability is about two things, about cost of wages, and it's about property. It's about rent. I mean, this is the most important part of what you produce. And they're not cheap in the Arab world. And the reason they're not cheap is because, so the issue here is one of competitiveness. Why? And the reason here is because the resources that come from the commodity sector tend to go into what we call the non-tradable sector, tend to go into wages, tend to go into property, raising the cost of production, making value added difficult to come by, and as a result, leaving the society, leaving the entrepreneur with only one other option, which is rent seeking, which is go out there and try to exploit the rents out of the system that comes from commodities. And that becomes about politics, it becomes about corruption, it becomes about living through the largesse of the state. So I'm arguing here, for anybody who's a technician about this is the notion of Dutch disease, right? This is a notion of that there's something about the region that lives so much on the resource that doesn't need creation, that doesn't need value added, that invites, forces the kind of corruption that we see. And the answer is, to my mind, is how do you make the system more competitive, more profitable, and wean the people away from their continuous need of trying to exploit that rent. So again, it's a question, it's a hypothesis. But I don't think it's a coincidence that rent-seeking activity of the kind that you're describing tend to be more concentrated in places that seem to be more commodity-based than those who aren't. On the financial sector, I was just making an observation, hopefully not from experience at all, but I sort of saw it because I actually did some work on it at some stage, which is the financial sector is very much part of the cronyism, very much part, and it's very much an endogenous part of the mechanism that you're describing. And it works on both sides. It works on the liability side, on the asset side. Banks are extremely profitable in the Arab world, right? And they're very profitable for two reasons. One, because the cost of funding is very low. Right? They can actually get deposits at very cheap interest rates. And they can have access to capital from the government, development banks, the World Bank, so from what we call quasi-fiscal. So the liability side is very, very cheap. The asset side, on the other hand, is also where the power is. It's the way in which you can lend that cheap money to people who you can share the profit with. They become part of that system. So that's why it's extremely profitable. I mean, one of the first things you want to do in the world is to privatize banks very quickly, because the guy who actually ends up getting it, which happens to be the son of the president very often, right, is the person who gets cheap funding on the one hand, and then can sort of distribute those cheap assets to people whose power they can share with. So it's not a coincidence, you have the chart in there, that a lot of the same people who are your politically connected firm seem to get their funding from other people who also themselves, I'm thinking of Hermes, the Haikal crowd, and
Citadel.
The Citadel, exactly, the Citadel, and then you see it in Lebanon, you see it in Tunisia as well. So it's I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that it's part of the system, and the way it works is through both the asset and liability side. And the final point I'm going to make is that, and maybe it's technical, but the way when we used to liberalize the financial sector, it's not a coincidence that the last thing we did was to liberalize deposit interest rates. We wanted to keep interest rates. I mean, the system wanted to keep interest rates so low, because it becomes a way in which you can transfer resources from savers to investors, from labor to capital. So anyway, the first one is a question, the second is more of an observation.
Right.
I'm going to stop there. I pontificated enough and ask people sort of if they ever want, if anybody wants to have a comment or ask a question to Ashab. Should we start with the gentleman here? No, you sir. No, you. Yeah.
so much. I've heard, as a brief disclaimer, I've heard some of this before from his house, but I want to ask you a question that's a little bit different. You started to mention a little bit about the, when we were talking stationary bandit versus roving bandit. From the point of view of the political agent, normally, and I'm not sure this is true, but I think that in a kind of normal traditional corruption type model, political connections are treated almost as a scarce resource from the point of view of the politician, which are actually enabling competition in a certain sense. People are coming to the politician and offering different kinds of deals, and it's the politician in a sense who gets to allocate scarce resources. What strikes me about what we saw here, especially the pictures around the missing middle, is that we don't, what's interesting and bizarre about these relationships is that they seem to be very durable. I mean, it seems to be the same firms from the very beginning of the regime to the very end that are keeping these political connections. And they don't seem to be changing or subject to competition between different firms or even between different sectors. It seems as if the politicians, the people, whatever bureaucratic agent is making is producing the corrupt relationships here, is being very deliberate and has made up their mind from the very beginning who's getting the relationship and who isn't. And why isn't that subject to corruption? Why doesn't that change over time? And does that say something about the particular characteristic of this type of capitalism in Egypt versus in the rest of the world?
I mean, yes, it's true. This is, I'm sure some people will look at it more from a historical perspective, and it's a dynamic system and things evolve over time. But clearly, a characteristic, in my mind, of the late period is the lack of competition between the cronies. And this is very surprising. In an earlier period, you would see Mubarak really trying to discipline them. He'd put them all in a room, he'll shout at them, there are few that go to court because, got the name now, there are a few corruption scandal over land, and so I mean, the system does try to discipline them. And what you observe over time is that they get stronger and the regime gets weaker. And obviously the regime knows that they are getting to the 2011 election. They want the jobs, they want this bet to work. Yet by the time they get close to 2011, they have gotten into the wall. It's the street rebels. The system, it hasn't worked. And basically, you have people asking, are these cronies, I mean, is Gamal Mubarak managing them, or are they managing him? Maybe they want him as a president in order for them to keep their privileges. So I think what has happened, certainly in Tunisia and Egypt, is that dynamically the regime has weakened over time, and these guys have become dominant. Now, at the same time, we have this movement from socialism. I mean, capitalism is very recent in the region, and so we don't have a lot of performance earlier either. Earlier, the system is just being built. The privatizations don't succeed. They break firms into pieces instead of putting them in the hands of capitalists that really develop them. So you don't get. Why is it then that we have more rent-seeking than value creation? Why don't we get these capitalists that want to create value? I mean, I'm sure there are in the system, but I think they got squeezed by the rent-seekers that became stronger as the regime got weaker. I don't really think it's oil, because when you think about it, I mean, let's think of another typology of the Arab world. There are some countries with a lot of oil and not many people. And it's the green ones, the labor poor, resource rich. And if you look at this is the rule of law, they are actually the least corrupt by official, by objective standards. These are the Emirates and the Saudis. This is control of corruption.
But that's comparing apples to oranges.
No. I mean, let me continue this idea.
Sorry, yeah.
So I want to say there are three types of countries. There are the countries that are very stable because they're very rich and they can really look to the long term. I mean, basically, they bribe everyone. You're around here states. They hire everybody in the state. They're very clientelistic. But they have the luxury to be able to think long term. So Saudi Arabia has actually extremely efficient industries. It exports more industrial products than Egypt, close to $22 billion now, while Egypt has about half that. Yeah.
No, of course it's true, but
Yeah, yeah.
that's because of incredible amount of subsidization of inputs. So they're overcoming the uncompetitiveness of labor by making the input extremely cheap. That's exactly the point I'm making, is that wages, they can afford to do it by exactly the same way, by creating, I mean, look
Not only. I mean, what I'm saying is because they can think long term, in this very clientelistic system, you have islands of quality that actually are extremely efficient. Now, on the other extreme, you have the countries with little oil, and these are the countries I'm talking about, Egypt and companies. And actually, in these regimes, you have some competition at the end of the day. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhoods have always been around. So these systems try to do as well as they can. They try to compete. And you know, they moderately succeeded because of the reason I talked about, this transition and the fact that they couldn't discipline their capitalists. But then you have the countries in between that have a lot of oil but a lot of people. And these are actually the red line here. They are the least successful of all. They are the ones with your real resource curse. This is Iraq, Iran, Algeria, Syria, Libya. These are regimes that actually trade off performance for power. I mean, they don't care at all about economic performance. They cannot bribe everyone. And you know, there are no cronies there really, because they completely, I mean, they don't care about the economy. These are regimes that are completely based on authoritarian, repressive machineries. They invest their oil in armies and security forces, basically. So this is the bigger picture. I think, you know, this is really the impact of oil, is the red line. It has some impact on I mean, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of oil actually gives you a good performance. A bit of oil gives you a terrible performance because of the choice between repression and rentierism. And then the Egypts of this world are somewhere in the middle.
But I guess the question I was when I said apples to oranges is corruption the actual metric through which you create that classification? Because it's not really petty corruption we're talking about, it's about in the marriage between the public and the private sector, which cannot be more vulgar than in Dubai, or Abu Dhabi, or Saudi Arabia. It cannot be even more vulgar than that. Yeah, no, more explicit.
If you think of the evolution of regimes, right? We start with a political settlement of sorts, right? A regime that can assure security and get political history to start. It typically rests on one person. It's very individualistic. And then development is about creating institutions, creating rule of law. Dubai has a system of rule of law at this stage. The ruler has played a very important role in making this all happen, but there are institutions and there are predictable rules. And so I wouldn't call this vulgar. I mean, you know, we've seen it grown and we look down at the system, but it has made a lot of progress.
I'm curious, for example, in a place like Egypt or Syria or countries that are sort of have a long history, a long political history, or socio-political history in a sense. Why hasn't there been some sort of political transparency or a kind of a political economy that could have complemented or the sort of the development of capital or the attempts at liberalization, the attempts at development? I mean, the country Egypt is fairly stable. I mean, it's for the last 50 years more or less. It's been ruled by the same kind of mindset. There are variations, of course, to some degree from one ruler to the next, but the political project, the political imagination, the political imaginary seems more or less to be the same, and I think this is applicable also to the rest of the Arab world. Just curious, why hasn't any of these from your graphs, I mean, your lines are just up and down. I mean, the economic transformation seems to be quite wild. Why did this not affect the economy and I mean the political process in any way?
Yeah. Well, a thought. I mean, I think a privately led economy requires a strong state, not a weak state. Because you have to regulate markets, you have to regulate competition, you need rule of law. And that's not easy. I mean, it's a bit surprising. Sometimes we think a weak state means the private sector leads, but it's not true. You need a strong state to get the private sector to be the engine of the economy. And what's ironic in the region is that we move to a private regime when the state is at its weakest, right? The state is at its weakest. For, you know, in the 50s, the nationalist states, they were all inward-looking, statist, and not just in the Arab world. I mean, this was a global fashion. However, you know, when that system collapses and goes bankrupt in the Arab world, we don't have a political opening. The regime is not replaced by another regime that could be strong and therefore have the credibility and the strength to lead to a new private sector, like happens in Eastern Europe. Instead, we have all dying regimes reinventing themselves without opening the economy. I didn't show you graphs about repression. We measure repression. Repression starts rising then because there is discontent, and it becomes a state of mukhabarat states. They can't capture the imagination of people anymore. They don't have a project that is credible. And it is this coalition, you know, which is, say, in Syria absurd, in Egypt less because the regime is less narrow. But it is this coalition of rulers with cronies, some of which are old wealth, but not all. You know, many are people that were, you know, the state bourgeoisie, if you like, that were at the head of these public enterprises, which privatize them to their own benefit. So I think this explains perhaps, you know, what you have in mind is the fact that the move to the private sector was done by regimes that have collapsed, basically, that had no legitimacy and strength at this stage to really police and build the basis of a strong private sector. And this is why I think, you know, these uprisings, let's say, I don't want to say revolutions at this stage, you know, had promise on the economic side. The real constraint to economic development had become political. So it needed political change.
Jamal had a question.
Yeah, I wonder, where do you categorize a situation in Egypt when I've heard 40% of the economy is controlled by the military or security forces in some sort of way through different enterprises? I mean, in some ways they're state actors, in other ways they're not state actors, and it's not quite the same as a private individual who might be completely connected, but they are in and out, and at the same time they are providing support for the regime, but they're also their own constituency. And how does this fit into the model?
Yeah.
Or are they?
I mean, I don't know if the army is 40%. I doubt. I think it's more like 10% or 15% of the economy. You know, they have small biscuit factories and this and that. There are also some interest. I mean, they control land that gives them some power. Basically, the budgets of the armies have been cut. I mean, the army has been under pressure. Mubarak competition. You know, Gamal was competing against the army, and police grew up a whole lot instead. So the army was unhappy with the way the country is going, and they took advantage, obviously, of what was happening and the instability that made people unhappy with the current situation to, whatever, manipulate their way back at the center. It's true. The army, the deep state have been there in Egypt and have made a big comeback. But where do I put it relative to this? If you remember in the typology, regime fragmentation weakens basically the ability of the regime to discipline its capitalists. And that's been going on in Egypt. You had several economies. You had the army-dominated economy. You had the Gamal Mubarak formal private sector. You had the Mukhabarat-dominated economy as well. And you had the informal economy dominated by the Brotherhood. So you have several economies. And what's interesting is they don't intersect much, actually. You know, the army doesn't finance itself in the stock market. The formal private sector does. The informal economy is under the radar screen, but it's also powerful. And people like Shatir, you know, made billions of dollars in that informal economy. So it is that fragmentation that also weakens the ability of the regime to discipline their cronies.
The question I have is that in this whole discussion of these different countries, all of them are former colonies of the West. And where does the relationship between the imperial powers of Europe and the United States and their active maintenance of these regimes, who, as you pointed out, are often quite inefficient, how do you describe, what's the quantitative or qualitative element in that relationship that affects the maintenance of these systems as in Egypt?
Yeah, I think you've answered your question. I mean, Wolfowitz wanted to put pressure on Mubarak to liberalize, I mean, put pressure on Mubarak to liberalize a little bit, right? But not too much. And so the 2005 elections, which were elections with maximum American pressure post-Iraq war to democratize, you know, allowed whatever, the Muslim Brotherhood had a third of parliament. But then, you know, Mubarak managed to overreact, and the 2010 elections, they were zero. The situation has changed. We had the war on terror that was accelerating. So, I mean, these regimes knew that they were supported, and that they had to pretend to reform this and that in order to satisfy the demands, the half-hearted demands, let's say, from the West, right? The situation, these demands have always been ambiguous. But at the end of the day, these regimes were supported. And Wolfowitz knew that. I mean, Wolfowitz cared a lot about the characters of regime at the end of the day. He knew that there was a limit to how much you could ask these regimes.
And you know, I've noticed recently in sort of post-conflict management theory, there's a focus on this notion of institutionalization before liberalization. If you don't get your institutions in place, then the prospects for things really working well economically, in a sort of more liberal economic context, they just don't get traction. And so I'm wondering if that would resonate with you.
Yeah,
in terms of the emphasis.
very much so. I think institutionalization, rule of law is the most important fuel for development for a long time. Democratization is a very long-term process. I mean, countries become democratic when they become fully democratic, if you like, when they become pretty rich. But rule of law, institutions that function, do also require some political space. Typically, they come from the elite. You know, it's competition between, you know, big companies and the business elite that drives institutionalization and the rule of law. They want to have clearer rules as to how they relate to the state and to each other. So, yeah, definitely. I think when I talk about democratization, it's in the very broad sense, but mostly in that sense, you know, allowing some of the social forces to shape the social outcomes. Yeah.
So on that note, join me in thanking Ishaq for what I thought was an exceptionally good